I want to say a few things about the background, where I'm coming from, but what I've been doing over the past decades also influences how I look at education and how I think about education, so it's useful to know a little of that. I was a physics teacher for about 10 years, and I think that is still somewhere inside me. I like clarity, at least for myself. I then studied education, or actually in the Netherlands it's called pedagogiek, which is close to a Danish word as well. And I also studied philosophy, but I see myself working in education, working on educational themes and topics. I taught pedagogiek at Dutch universities for about 10 years, and then I had enough of Dutch universities. So I moved to England, where I worked at the University of Exeter and became involved a lot in teacher education, in vocational subjects. So I was teaching carpenters and plumbers and car mechanics and beauty therapists to become teachers of their subjects. Then I worked in Scotland for 5 years, focusing a lot on the further professional development of teachers. And the last 2 years I was in Luxembourg. Currently I'm doing some things in London with Brunel University, and I work also with a big art college in the Netherlands, which is fun to do. And the other thing I mentioned there on my CV is that I was recently appointed in the Netherlands on what is called the Education Council, which is a group of 14 people who are supposed to give advice to the government and the parliament on educational matters, which is quite an interesting place to be. There is no obligation on the side of the government or the parliament to take this advice seriously, but at least we're getting a bit closer. The chair of that committee is a professor of evidence-based education. So I think we sort of occupy the two extremes of the spectrum, but we're having a good time. My work focuses a lot on theoretical dimensions of education, always with an eye on policy, because policy is doing a lot in the field of education, and it's important to keep a close eye on what's happening and trying to analyze. Also, in order then to be able to speak back when policy goes in a strange direction. And from conversations I've had during these days, but also before, is at least I've picked up that in Denmark education policy is going in a very particular direction, and that there are concerns about that at a number of different levels, and I think I'm sharing some of those concerns. I write quite a lot, and I have been very fortunate that some of the books that I consider to be my main books have been translated into Danish, so that's great as well. The focus of my talk will be around education, and I will cover some familiar ground for people who know that work, and I'll hope to add some questions that have to do with this bigger question: what matters in education, or what should matter in education? I have a number of favorite expressions picked up in the UK. If you stand for nothing, you will fall for anything, is an expression I really like, because it shows something of the predicament of education in relation to policy. That policy, but not only policy, has often very clear ideas about what should happen. If, as educators, we do not know where we want to stand and what we find important, then there is a risk that we are shown all the corners of the room, as they say in England. But the other expression is also a nice one, and I don't know whether there is an equivalent in Danish: to teach your grandmother to suck eggs. And this you say to a person who tries to explain something to someone where this person already knows everything that you're trying to explain. And sometimes that's what I feel I'm doing in my work. I actually don't claim that I say a lot of things about education that are new, but I do see that the things I talk about and write about often have become marginalized or forgotten in the way people talk about education or do education. For me, this is partly the result of language, and I'll talk a bit more about language a little later. But I think that some of the language we have to talk about in education has sort of moved us away from what really matters or should matter in education. And sometimes when people say positive things about my work, the one I'm really pleased about is when teachers say, for example, you give language to what we feel but are not really able to express. Then I think something important is happening there. Also because what I'm trying to say is not alien to the practice of education, but it's sometimes difficult to articulate. So language really matters to me. But the other thing that is typical for education in many settings and situations is that we work in systems that often try to push us in a particular direction. And it's that pressure as well that often then results in a situation where we begin to forget why we are actually doing what we are doing. That's why I'm asking the question today, what matters in education, what should matter in education, and at a very basic level, what is it actually all about? And it's remarkable sometimes that this question is not asked enough. So I think we need to keep coming back to that question. At least as educators, we should know why we are there. Now, one of the interesting things about education is that everyone is a specialist in education because we all have gone to school. So there is no lack of opinions about what education should be and what should matter. What I want to look at are sort of 3 answers you can give to this question, what should matter in education. And I do that by putting here 3 words, and the first, there is a typo, that should be learning. The second is development, and the third is formation. And in answers to what is education about, you can see these as 3 different trends. The learning answer has become a very popular answer, and I'll say a bit more about it in a minute, but it's also something I have been writing about for quite a long time. But you see a lot of phrases circulating in education where the word learning appears, and I've listed a number of them on the screen. That's not the only one. The other one that I think has become quite popular, I see it a lot in how schools present themselves, is a language of development that says this is a school where we want the children to develop all their talents, or we want children to reach their full potential. That's a slightly different language, and I also, in my presentation, want to come back to that way of thinking. And then there is a third concept, and my plan for the talk is to argue that that actually is a concept that lies most closely to what I think should matter in education. So I have a preference here, which is a word that in English you can call formation, which in English is not a common word, but it also expresses something. This is not really a popular term, at least not in English, also not in Dutch, for example. So if the other 2 are popular, this one is maybe a more old or old-fashioned concept, but nonetheless, I see something in that concept that may be of value. Now, there is an issue of translation here, because the Danish language has concepts that are different from that. I always keep forgetting which, is it Dannelse here, or, yeah. Now, one thing that is important for me is not to put the word Bildung there. There is a little joke there where I say we should leave Bildung to the Germans, because it's already a big enough problem for them, and we shouldn't export those problems. I'm partly saying that because I've worked a lot with colleagues from Germany who are very critical of Bildung because they say it has had a very problematic history within German education. I'm also saying it because I now see, particularly in the English-speaking world, that people who are critical of what's happening in education say, let's go to Bildung and then all these problems are solved. And I think we should be careful with making that move. That's why I like to stick to a slightly more precise term for the moment, this idea of formation. And what I like in that notion of formation is that it has the word form in it. One way in which I look at education is that I see it as a kind of encounter, and this sounds abstract, but I'll fill it in a little more later, an encounter between child and world, or student and world. What happens in that encounter and what should happen is that in some way the child should come into the world, but the world is not void, it's not an empty place, the world is full of tradition, knowledge, ways of doing. So you can say that if the child comes into that world, a kind of transformation of metamorphosis happens in which the child acquires a worldly form. That for me has something to do with the dynamics of education. And I'll try to say a bit more about what this form is towards the end of my talk. That's why in some of my work, when I try to characterize what I'm trying to do, I sometimes use the phrase world-centered education, because you have child-centered education, you have curriculum-centered education. For me, the key angle to look at education has something to do with the world in which we exist. If this sounds mysterious, it's either because it is mysterious or maybe some of the clarity will come a little later. So I'll try to clarify some of this towards the end of my talk. What I now want to do is to go back to this notion of learning, say a few things about that. That gives me the opportunity to look at the question what matters and what kind of values and reference points play a role there. Then I'll say something about development and I'll end up with formation. This is something that you may have come across, but maybe also not. It's an observation I made now about 10 years ago, that this language of learning has become very prominent in talking about education and doing education. In English, you see a lot of shifts. I've mentioned a number of those shifts here, that we no longer talk about pupils or students or children or even human beings, but call them learners. That teaching is often called facilitation of learning, that schools are learning environments, and there's a whole wider idea about learning environments, and that also the field of adult education has been redesigned as lifelong learning. And I've seen similar shifts happening in other languages as well. I've characterized this as the rise of a new language of learning, because learning in itself is an old concept, but it has become very prominent, and it is very present in the way in which a lot of talk about education in policy and research and practice is going on. I've also seen it at a level which from my perspective is quite extreme, which was something that happened in Sheffield, a big city in the north of England, where two primary schools had to merge, and when schools merge they need to think about a new name. But these two schools went a step further, because they said, we no longer want to call ourselves a school. And the argument for that apparently was that they said school has such a bad name and such a bad image. So we want to call ourselves something else, and they called themselves a place for learning. And you see this phrase, a place for learning, popping up in all kinds of places as well. Also in professional education, higher education, and maybe also in Google Hangout on the web. There are also these virtual places for learning. There is a problem here. I'll show you the problem in a minute. This is not in itself an argument against learning, although my book was called Against Learning. But it's an argument that tries to make something visible about the limitations of learning as an educational language. So that's the point I'm trying to make. But later on this afternoon, we may have opportunity to go a bit further into that. This is one way in which I try to capture the problem. I do that by saying that for me, the point of education is not that children or students learn. And by education, I mean something quite specific. I mean that we spend time and energy and money to bring people together in a building or a particular setting with the aim that education happens. When we do that, I think it's not enough to say that what should happen there is that the children or the students learn. I'd rather say, and this is maybe the subtle difference, but for me I think it's an important difference. In education, I think the point is always that students learn something, that they learn it for a purpose, and that they learn it from someone. And these three aspects, the content and the purpose and the relationships, are for me three educational questions that we always need to ask when we organize something, bring people together, or as a society say to children, you have to go to that setting or that building or that institution for the next 10 years of your life. Then we need to engage with the question, what is it about, what is it for, and what are the particular relationships that happen there. My problem with the language of learning is that that language often leads us away from asking these questions. I see that a lot in research on education, particular research that tries to assess the impact of some kind of educational strategy. And very often I read the paper that says we wanted to assess the impact of this on student learning. And if that's all, then for me, in a sense, things are already lost, because I think student learning is not precise enough. And I'll try to give a bit more precision a little later. But when you just think of examples of where we use the word learning, like learning that 2 and 2 equals 4, learning the second law of thermodynamics, which is quite an interesting law, learning to ride the bicycle, learning to be patient, learning that you're actually not good at something. In all this, we use the word learning, but it refers to very different dynamics, very different results, very different processes. This, for me, is a limitation already of the word learning, that it's just not precise enough. So the language of learning, you can say, runs the danger of not being a helpful language if we need to talk in education. That's my concern. That's why I've referred to that development with the word learnification, which doesn't exist in English and sounds like a problematic or an ugly word, and that's intended there. Of these three, content, purpose, and relationships, my point is, and I'm not claiming that this is a deep point, that the question of purpose is the central and fundamental question. Because if we can't articulate what it is we want to achieve with our students, if we can't articulate what we want our students to achieve, we have no criterion to decide what content matters there, nor have we got a criterion about how to use relationships in an educative way. So of the three, for me, it starts with the question of purpose. And then there is something interesting, which I believe we as educators should really be very explicit about, because for me it shows something about the complexity and the difficulty of education as a job that is unlike any other field of work. So I would claim, but don't quote me on this, that teaching actually is one of the most difficult jobs because of a very specific complexity. And I'll show something about where this complexity comes back. It starts again with quite a simple observation that when we are engaging in educational activities, we never work only in one dimension, but we are actually impacting on a number of dimensions. And in the way in which I have tried to conceptualize that, I make a distinction between three domains in which educational activities have influence, impact, or significance. You can say education is always about something. Even this talk is about something. So there are always questions of knowledge and skills involved in education. Teachers, curricula offer knowledge and skills, students get knowledge and skills. Through that, students become qualified to do something. You can think of professional qualifications or becoming qualified to live in a complex Western society. So this dimension, which is known in the literature, is often referred to as the qualification dimension of education. If that was the only thing that we needed to take care of in education, our job would be easy, maybe. At least we would only need to take care of one dimension. The point I'm making here is that there are two other dimensions that are also at play, and therefore we also need to take care of those. One dimension is one that in the literature is known as socialization, and this has to do with the way in which traditions come into play. The way in which we represent traditions and the way in which we invite students to take position in those traditions or become part of those traditions. We do an awful lot of that in primary and secondary school, presenting our society, our world in a particular way. It also happens very explicitly in professional education, where we try to engage students with particular ways of being a professional. And these are quite clear and confined. So that's another dimension in which we work. And I think it's always also there. There is a conservative idea of schools that says schools are just institutions for the transmission of knowledge. But even if you only say this is what we do, then you are already communicating a particular view about the school, a particular view about knowledge, a particular view about teaching. So that's always there as well. And then I would say there is a third dimension where you can say very quickly, education also impacts on the person. It either limits people's possibilities or it widens their possibilities, for the good or for the worse. I think people who know of Bildungs traditions or Donaldson traditions know that this is an important part of education as well. In my own work, I've used the concept of subjectification to talk about that, and in it you find the word subject, which is a more philosophical way to talk about the person or the human being. I have a particular reason for it because there is something nice in the word subject. It not only means that we are sort of the origin of actions, but subject also means to be subjected to something else. And I'll say a little later why that is important as well. So this simply starts from looking at education and saying, what are sort of the potential impacts? They are in these three domains, I would claim. And then I would say, if this is what happens as soon as a teacher opens her mouth or as soon as we open a textbook, then as educators we need to take responsibility for these three domains. So there are three functions of education. We can analyze how education functions in these three domains. But I also call them three domains of purpose. Three areas in which we always need to ask, what is it that we want to achieve and what we want our students to achieve. I'm looking at my watch. There is a small detail here about this word subjectification, because some people like what I say here and then they say, oh, with this third dimension, subjectification, you mean identity. For people who thought that that's what I meant, identity for me has to do with the domain of socialization. Because for me, identity is the question, who am I? Which is a question we always answer in relation to existing traditions, either to say, I am part of that tradition, or I distinguish myself from that tradition. Subjectification, the question of subjectness, is the question, how am I? It's the question how we exist. Independent, dependent, autonomous and critical, compassionate. So it's a different set of qualities. That's what I have in mind here. But this is a detail. Out of this, you can draw a very simple picture about education and its domains of purpose. I like to do it in a Venn diagram because we can distinguish these three domains, but we cannot really separate them. So for me, real education always, in a sense, happens at the intersection of these three domains. This is a picture, you could say, of a broad conception of education, where we say, as educators, we need to pay attention to the subject matter, to the tradition, and to the person. And maybe this is not very controversial, unless people have very specific extreme ideas about what actually education should care for and what not. And this is one thing that I think is currently happening in education, and maybe it has always happened in some way. Namely, that policy, for example, wants to put an emphasis only on one of these domains. And what many countries are currently suffering from is an extreme emphasis on the domain of qualification. To say that what really matters are knowledge and skills, and we need to measure them, and then we put them in a league table, and then we know who is the best. That, I think, is a problem because it creates an imbalance in what I think education should take care of. So I'm saying that it shows what the problem is when we reduce education to only one domain. Currently, we're suffering a lot from an emphasis on qualification, but the picture shows that there are three ways in which you can be one-sided. Education that only focuses on the person, which is sometimes known in the literature as extreme child-centered education, is also out of balance because those extreme forms tend to forget that there is also knowledge that matters and that there is also a society that is not just anything. Education that only focuses on socialization is also out of balance because it forgets the other two as well. When you look at it in this way, you can see how education gets out of balance. When education gets out of balance, it also means that the areas that are not in the picture suffer from it, because things can happen there if we don't pay sufficient attention to it. The example I gave yesterday as well was, I was at a conference in South Korea a couple of years ago, and the scholars from South Korea entered the room and they said, this is a lovely conference with a fantastic theme, but actually at this point in time in this country there is only one thing that we should be talking about, and that is the huge damage that our high performance system is doing to our young generation, where many young people are actually killing themselves because of the extreme pressure on qualification. That for me is a really telling example of what goes wrong if we put all the emphasis on one area, because you can see that it leads to destructive problems in the other areas. So I think there is a real challenge for all education at all levels to keep things in balance. To keep things in balance, and here we can begin to see what makes education special and difficult, therefore means that we need to think in a three-dimensional way, and that we need to act in a three-dimensional way. Not only as educators, but also at the level of policy and the level of research. And I see a lot of policy that is not three-dimensional, but actually one-dimensional. I also see a lot of research that has a one-dimensional view to look at education. So it says we are interested in the impact of this and that on learning. What is very often meant is we're interested in the impact on qualification. What that kind of research often forgets to do is to see what, if you have an intervention or something that impacts on qualification, what it actually does in the other domains. And if you do not take that into consideration, you actually get educational research that's not very useful. And I see that happening a lot also in the research that comes out of an evidence tradition. So there isn't, you can say, a problem with evidence as such, but one problem is that a lot of that research is one-dimensional. So for me, it doesn't really connect to the complexity of education. So three-dimensionality is an important challenge here. When I teach about this, I always offer my students a bar of chocolate. I know it's a bit low as an offer, but nonetheless, to see whether maybe they can come up with a fourth dimension or whether these three dimensions roughly sort of map what we are concerned about. I still have the bar of chocolate, so no one has yet met my challenge, but I'm tough in that as well. But I think it gives a reasonable sense of at least that there are different areas here. I also find the picture important because it allows teachers to show much more clearly what the complexity of their job is. Because as teachers, we constantly need to think and work and observe in this three-dimensional way. So when I was looking for a picture, and this is the picture I showed when I was here 2 years ago, I thought the complexity of teaching is like the complexity of simultaneous chess, where the teacher plays different chess games with all students. And this is one thing good teachers do. They keep each of their students in some way in their mind and their head and their heart. But when we see that teaching is a three-dimensional act, there's actually a different game that we need to look at, which is this game. Three-dimensional chess. I don't know whether you know it. The interesting thing about three-dimensional chess is precisely that it shows the complexity of taking care of three dimensions, because you have three chess games here with full set of pieces on each chessboard. But when you move a piece on one board, it not only has implications in the horizontal plane, but also in the vertical plane. So that makes it a complicated game to play, but it shows precisely the problem of teaching, that if we make a move in the domain of qualification, it has implications in the domain of socialization and subjectification. So these moves are never neutral and just confined to one of the games. They have impact in the other domains, and that is a complexity of teaching. This game does exist. I was looking for one picture from popular culture, which is still from Star Trek, where it's played. But it's also played in, what is it, the Big Bang Theory, I think. Okay, if this means what is implied when we engage with the question of purpose in education, it raises a number of questions. And I'll do those quickly and then move to my next point. One question it raises, and these questions appear at all levels, so they appear for teachers in classrooms, they appear for curriculum developers, they also appear for policy, I think. One question is relatively straightforward. What is it that we actually want to achieve in each of these domains? And the answer to that is a different question when we look at primary education, secondary education, vocational education, professional education, higher education. But the question is there for all these levels and sectors. Within that question, we should be careful that we don't forget what the ultimate dynamics of education is. That it's not a question of setting the targets right and then making sure that our students get there. There is an underlying ambition or duty for education, that it's not only about connecting our students to everything that we prepare for them, but that we also need to let our students go. In more theoretical terms, you can say all education needs to work with the tension between engagement and emancipation. The worst thing that can happen in the life of a teacher is if a student is not able to let go. These students that 10 years after they have left school still phone up the teacher and say, "Teacher, I have a problem and I don't know how to deal with that myself, can you help me?" That shows that education at some point needs to end, and that is part of the ambition. But we do that through engaging our students first with everything that is on offer. So this is one question we need to answer. The second question is the question, how then do we organize education? How do we give it shape and form? You can say that's a question of form. You can also say this is a question of technology. But I mean technology here in a broad sense. So chalk or a textbook are also technology for me. It's about the forms and the things we use. Here is another important point where I think education is quite different from many other fields of work. Because this is not just a question of the effectiveness of what we do, and an awful lot of research focuses on the effectiveness, which is fine. But there is an additional question, which is the question of what I've called here the educative quality of what we do. And this, for me, puts a real limit on all the effectiveness research and effectiveness talk. And the idea behind it is very simple. The idea is that students not only learn from what we say, they also learn from how we say it or how we do it. So the form of organization and the form of presentation itself has an educative effect. And good teachers know that and therefore always need to make a double decision, not only what will work in the effectiveness sense, but also what is the educative quality of doing it in this particular way. Again, if research forgets to ask this question, research misses an essential dimension of the dynamics of education. The classical example in the literature is about reward and punishment, where you can say reward and punishment can be very effective in producing a particular result. But these are instruments that signal something about intrinsic motivation, extrinsic motivation, about force and power. And the real question is, do we want to convey these messages to our students? I made a claim yesterday in Copenhagen where I said if Denmark wants to become #1 in PISA, I can do that for Denmark. It will cost me 2.5 years, maybe 3, but we can sort it out. But don't ask me what the educative quality of that project is, because it means, for example, that we need to pay students, we really need to push their performance, we need to give them all kind of incentives that may make them entirely cynical about the world, but they will perform. This, I think, is part of the predicament that we always need to ask, what are we actually doing here? What is the educative message that comes out of what we want to do? So effectiveness and educative quality are both a dimension of concern at the level of teaching, at the level of curriculum design, even at the level of architecture. This building also says something about what we want to achieve educationally. And then I couldn't resist saying something about digital technology, because I see the problem there as well. I think that digital technology has resulted in a very hyped discussion around education, where people expect an awful lot from digital technology. And I think we need to keep a cool head there and ask these questions. What is it actually what we want to achieve? Where can technology help? And where does technology hinder? If we forget that, then we put the cart before the horse, or we let the tail wagging the dog, to just mentioned two nice images there. And then there is something which maybe is the most difficult question of all, because if education is indeed this three-dimensional work, these three dimensions are in tension. It's really difficult to keep them together because they pull us in slightly different direction. If we just want to get high achievements in the domain of qualification, we can do that with bribes and whatever, but when we start that, we are really beginning to do something that is stupid with regard to the kind of people we want our students to become. So the real challenge is, how do we keep these things in balance, knowing that sometimes, and good teachers know that we do need to pay attention to one of these dimensions. Sometimes we do say to a child, now you really have to work on your sums. Sometimes we say, this is actually not very important. Now you really need to make sure that you play with your friends and develop your ability to be together with other young people. So the key challenge here is always, how do we keep the three in a meaningful balance? And that meaningful balance is different for each child at each moment in their educational career. That is what the good teachers are always working with, or should be working with. So if these are sort of three questions that come out of looking at education in this three-dimensional way, the answer to these questions, that's my claim, are not answers that research can give us or that policy can specify for us. These are typical questions that require judgment, which means a judgment about concrete, unique situations we find ourselves in. Not only judgments about how to do things, but also about what is to be done. Judgment, therefore, has a normative dimension. Judgment is not black or white. Judgment is not just based on facts. Judgment brings in values, ultimately things we value about education. But what lies behind that are things we value about our human existence together on this planet. So there are important questions then to ask about what are sort of the wider values that can sustain or should sustain what happens in education. And I want to say a few things about that in order then to work towards some conclusions. Which values, which frames of reference, which point of directions are important for the educative project in our society? As I said before, there is no lack of opinions and answers in education. And one story that is often told nowadays goes roughly like this. And probably you'll recognize it. The first thing I always find in those stories is the claim that society is changing at a very high pace. And reference is made to globalization, digitalization, individualization, and all kind of other izations. The second thing I often encounter, and when you begin to see this, you begin to see it everywhere, is this claim that we do not know what the future will look like. That in itself is true, and therefore it's not really an interesting statement, but nonetheless, when you look at a lot of policy documents, they make this point, and then they add something like, therefore the knowledge we have today is already outdated tomorrow. Sometimes you see a third layer in this story that says, we use a 20th century or even a 19th century educational system to prepare students for the 21st century. And when you hear this, you are supposed to respond, oh, that's really bad. So there is a lot of rhetorics happening in these stories as well. And then people draw the conclusion where they say, therefore, education needs to be completely transformed. And these transformations tend to respond to some of these ways of looking at things. For example, they say knowledge is not really important because knowledge is changing all the time. Let's rather give our students skills, including the skill to get knowledge. Because society is changing rapidly and we don't know the future, the skills that the students need are then skills that allow them to adapt in a flexible way to this ongoing changing society. I read this, for example, in the rationale for something like 21st century skills, which in some countries has become very popular. So this is the story, and this is the question. We could do a vote, but in the interest of time, I'll give some further reflections on it. I already mentioned the rhetorical dimension of what is happening here. When rhetoric comes into play, I think what we often encounter is not something that is true or false, but that is partly true and partly not. And if we are not aware of the bits that are true and the bits that are not true, then often the thing that is being told becomes quite seductive, and it becomes quite difficult to intervene and say, but wait a minute. This is also the problem with evidence, that if you want to argue against evidence, then people say, but you don't want to base your practices just on anything you make up. So there is rhetorical stuff happening there as well. My suggestion is that we are seeing in stories like these, and these stories are really influential in policy, is that they are half-truths. And I want to show where I think truth lies and where the truth misses something. Take this claim: society is changing at a very high pace. When you Google, it's very easy to find pictures that show this. All these things that are changing very rapidly. Technology, economy, stock market, and so on. But that's not all that's happening, because for other people who do not live in privileged, extremely wealthy parts of the world where we live in other domains of life, things are actually remarkably constant. I think that there are more people on this planet who still each day need to figure out where they will get clean water and food to get through the day than the obsession with stock markets or the rapid global economy. So it's very important to see where things are changing and where they are not changing. The same with this reference towards the future. We do not know what the future will look like, and then this implication, therefore, the knowledge we have now is outdated when tomorrow arrives. And again, you can say, when you begin to look more precisely, there are some parts of the world, some people, and some dimensions where this is true. There are things that really change. But I am willing to predict something about the future, namely that in 50 years from now, well, there will still be people alive who are in the room today, I hope so. Some things will still be a big problem and may even be a bigger problem. The democratic question: how do we manage to live together if we value plurality and diversity? That will be an issue in the future as much as it is an issue today. The ecological question: how do we live on a planet that puts limits on what we want from it? And the care question: how do we care for each other, and how do we care particularly for those who are not able to care for themselves? This is part of our future, and part of the argument here is that this is so because it is also part of our past. Here we find some dimensions that have to do with living and living together. So if we forget these dimensions, before we know it, we put education on a very limited, half-true trajectory. So it's really important when we think about the bigger reference points that we don't fall for these stories that only tell us half. You can say a story that's convenient for some. For some, it's very convenient to say the world is changing rapidly, or knowledge of today doesn't matter in the future. But some knowledge that we have fought for very hard, for example, that there is inequality in our societies, that knowledge is tremendously important knowledge, where we cannot simply say that knowledge is no longer relevant tomorrow. So this is my suggestion to say, let's be very careful where we get our reference points from and what the stories are that we tell about our societies, about our present condition, and about our future. And then I want to bring that back to education in order to make my final point. And I have 7 minutes for that, which is another thing I can already predict about the future. I can also predict that I probably need a bit more than 7 minutes, but that's me. What does it mean for education? As I indicated, in many countries, I think there is a strong tendency to think about the future of education, development of education, education policy, in relation to a particular story that puts a strong emphasis on the economy, and particularly the global economy, that says that competition is a fact of life rather than a particular way in which we want to live our lives, and that emphasizes the need for survival. Skills to adapt flexibly to a constantly changing environment is a survival way of thinking. This then often leads to a particular definition of the basics of education. And this lies behind a lot of these policy developments that say, if this is the world we are in, then this is what education needs to deliver for our survival in that world. That's where PISA is doing something, that's where national policies are also doing something. The point I at least want to make is to say we need a broader frame of reference than only the economy, only competition, only survival. I've put my stake on saying we need to think, for example, about democracy, about ecology, and about care as 3 dimensions of our human existence that we need to take care of and that should be part of how we organize education. So if you were to ask me what actually are the real basics of education, I'd rather go here and then say, okay, reading and writing and all these things have a place as well, but there is something more fundamental that we should take care of. For me, it also means that we should not push the economy out. We shouldn't say it's irrelevant, but I think there is a real challenge to start doing economy differently, because the mainstream economy and the mainstream in which we are doing it is an unsustainable way to deal with questions of money and questions of value and question of exchange. So we need to go towards a different economy. I also think that competition maybe works in the short term, and a lot of thinking about global economy is all about competition, but just as the financial crisis was ultimately a crisis of time, where we ran out of time, we can also now see this with global competition. For a long time, the West was comfortable in the center of everything. Then the East started to emerge. Then the BRIC countries, now a different set of countries. So you see things speeding up there as well. And competition is great when you are on the winning side of the game. Competition is not that great when you are at the losing end. So there I also think that competition is not a sustainable way to think about our longer-term existence together. For me, that also means that survival is actually not the concept we need to have to inform our educational endeavors. Survival, I would say, but I know I'm a bit extreme, ultimately means that my survival goes before your existence. For me, life is actually something else, where at the most impressive moments we find people who actually say, my life is not as important as your life is. Then we're not talking about survival, but then we're talking about life. And we shouldn't forget those moments because they show us something else. What might that mean for education? Here's the last twist in the argument. If we say, okay, let's stay away from survival, let's put life at the center. Do we then go from this sort of vague learning discourse to the development discourse, where we say, therefore it's really important that in schools we let children develop all their talents and their full potential? And this is a discourse that I also see. I think that this is an educational mistake, and I just want to point out the mistake. It's a mistake nonetheless, because the talents we have are not all fantastic, positive, great, life-enhancing talents. We, and also the children, but maybe we just need to look at ourselves, have talents for the good and for the bad. In terms of supporting the child's development, morality and criminality are both the outcome of development. So here is a language issue as well. If as educators say, our task is to develop all the talents of the children or to support their full development, we are actually fooling ourselves, because what we are after and should be after, you can say, are the right talents and the right development, which is a far more difficult question. For me, that means that what we actually do as educators is something where I've put the word interruption. We do not simply let all development flow, but as good educators, from time to time, we interrupt, we say, wait a minute, what is emerging here? And is what is emerging what we want to emerge? So it is slowing down, creating space in which we can ask that question, and where we can also, you can say, give this question to the children and students we educate in the hope that it will become their own question. The question they carry with them, the question is what I desire, that's another way of putting it. Is that what is desirable for me? Is it desirable for me, for my own life? And is it desirable for the life we live together on a planet with limited resources? So for me, this moment of interruption is actually what I think good educational work does. When it does so, it is not trying to suppress the child. It's rather interested in a particular transformation. It's in a sense trying to help the child, but I'll come back to the child in a minute, to move away from an egocentric way of being, where the self is the only frame of reference, to, you can say, another centered way of being. So this kind of moment is a strange moment where, in a sense, we offer an interruption or a limitation to the child, because in that way there is an opportunity to overcome self-centeredness. Other words we can put there, and these are very traditional words that come with a history, but nonetheless I think we need to recapture the important educational dimension of that, is to talk about the distinction between an infantile way of being, where we are driven by our own desires and our own frames of reference, and a grown-up way of being, where the grown-up way of being always asks this question, is what I want from my particular perspective, is that actually good for the life to live with others? Now I use these notions grown-up and infantile, and the words are not ideal, because grown-up suggests something that gets into the direction of growth or development. And there are ideas that says to become a grown-up is a process of development, and at a particular point we are a grown-up for the rest of our lives. In the legal domain that may be true, but for me grown-upness and infantileness are challenges that we carry with us throughout our lives. So in each situation we encounter, there is a possibility for us either to respond in a grown-up way or to respond in an infantile way. And one of the tasks for education is to make this distinction visible to children and let them practice with what it means to work in a grown-up way. By this, I definitely do not want to give children a bad name, because I know many people who have these big bodies like we have, who actually hardly ever mention to be in a situation in the grown-up way. And I know many people with these little bodies that we call children, who are actually very able to sustain social ways of being in a grown-up way. So I call it an existential challenge rather than something that has to do with development or age. So you can say grown-upness means that we are in the world, we're not with ourselves, we are in that world where we exist, but we do not put ourselves in the center of the world. We understand that there are other human beings there and that there is a planet that tries to say something to us as well. So it is about transforming, you could say, our desires so that they can actually help us to exist in this world in a grown-up way. That maybe has been an important theme for education anyway. I think it has become particularly urgent in a world where we are constantly being told by advertising, for example, that we need to get more desires. This is how capitalism works. Capitalism works because it needs to grow. In order to grow, capitalism needs to sell more stuff. It could do that by going to countries that not yet had our stuff, but the whole world is full of stuff already. Think about IKEA, for example. So the only way in which capitalism can still grow is to plant new desires in us. Never to limit our desires, but to multiply our desires. iPhone 4, iPhone 5, iPhone 6. So we live in a world that very strongly says you need more desires, rather than you need to look at your desires and see whether your desires are sustainable for your own life and the life with others on this planet. That's why I think this is even a more urgent task for education today. And this is not something we only find in education. The question of democracy is also that question. How do we limit ourselves so that we can exist together? The question of ecology is also that question. What limitations puts the planet on our desires? And the question of care plays an important role there as well. That brings me to just a sum up. I've tried to say something about what I think good education is, and that is education that tries to stay in balance and tries to stay thinking and working in a three-dimensional way. And when you ask me what should matter in education, can we capture that in the language of learning? Not really, I think. Can we capture it in the language of development? I've shown some dangers there. I like the language of formation because this says something about the forms we need to develop to be able to exist together in this world. And that is a question where grown-upness is at stake. And for me, this is a basic of education that we shouldn't forget. I don't know whether you agree with me, but I hope at least that you want to think a bit about this, and then we need to see where we go from here. Thank you very much.